Hey everyone, it's Jamison Cable of the Land Between the Meadows, Kentucky History Podcast. I just want to say thank you for your support and listening to this episode. For all the updates on our podcast and YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kentucky History Channel, like and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at KY History Pod. If you're enjoying the podcast, give us a good rating and review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast platform that you're listening to. If you're looking for ways to support the podcast, an easy and simple way is to share it on Facebook or any other social media and tell your friends. You can also go to audibletrial.com/KYHistoryPod and get a free book of your choice. And finally, you can visit patreon.com/KYHistoryPod if you want extra content from us. If you're already a patron, thank you for your support. It means so much to us. All the links I've mentioned are in the description of the podcast, so go check them out. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. And remember, if it's not about Kentucky, it ain't worth a hill of beans.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines, where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pine.
I remember 61 years ago, Jameson, standing in a large crowd of mainly men on a side street of Mount Sterling, Kentucky. My dad had taken me out of school to witness the event. We had left before dark. We'd eaten breakfast of eggs over easy with country ham and homemade biscuits in a little country diner near Winchester. We took the old road from Lexington to Mount Sterling because there was no superhighway or interstate highway at that time. And I remember my father, who was a professor of church history at the Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington and a minister. He was a man who really enjoyed Agrarian Kentucky and identified with it. He, even though he was highly intellectual, his favorite thing to do was to walk in the woods and listen to dogs bay and so forth. And in case you don't know what Court Day at Mount Sterling is or was back then, it was a gathering of people, mainly from the mountains, from your area, and as well as other places, who met some people from the bluegrass. But they came there kind of as a huge flea market, one of the first ones, where not only just a flea market, but in Mount Sterling they had railroad tracks. And down on the railroad tracks, men would come in with shotguns over their shoulders and rifles and pistols. They'd bring horses to trade. Hunting dogs. They had hunting dogs everywhere, baying, and men would tell big stories and lies about them and so forth and trade them. And they had like a pool, as I remember, and people would make sure that the guns they traded for would shoot. So you'd hear this boom, boom, boom of guns going off constantly. And there was just an aura of excitement. People were selling wild honey and sorghum molasses, Menifee County sorghum, you know, and tin pails that my daddy would always buy half gallon of. And it was really, really exciting atmosphere. The streets were just shoulder to shoulder with people. And at this particular moment, because I was only 8 years old, my dad wanted to hold my hand because, you know, there were such crowds of people. And they were closing in on a man who was standing alone on the top of an old tobacco wagon that had been pulled onto the street there. And there were people drinking. There were bars in Mount Sterling at that time. You know, it was a rough crowd. And like I said, mainly men. His name was John Sherman Cooper. And he was a famous senator, I guess, from eastern Kentucky. And he was doing what my dad called was a stump speech. Well, I thought a stump speech would be on a stump. You know? But he was on a tobacco wagon. And it was like the last clothing chapters of you know, the old tradition of debates that men would have on the frontier before radio or television. It was not recorded. He merely stood on a tobacco wagon, and I remember he started with a joke that made everyone laugh. And he was a very popular man, and people would crowd into the wagon. And he served not only as a politician, but as an entertainer.
Yeah.
Because in order to keep the crowd, you had to entertain them.
Yeah.
So he would say things that the crowd would cheer and roar, and some of them would be inflammatory, off color. Didn't matter.
Yeah.
He just wanted to entertain, but he also wanted to get his political point across. And I have often thought, thinking back on politics in Kentucky today, that that's a lot of what we have. And we even still have those old traditions from Agrarian Kentucky, an agrarian America.
Yeah.
Where it's not so much what the person is saying. It's not intellectual. It's emotional.
Yeah.
It's appealing to your base. It's the people who and you tell them what they want to hear, and you also use forms of talk that excite them. Don't incite a riot. Well, no, in politics you do want to incite a riot sometimes in order to get people's attention.
Yeah.
And this has become a tradition in Kentucky especially, where, and we see it today, where politicians will say things just to excite their base, rather than to use their intellect to change the course of society.
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever the tradition is, maintain it. You know, and in Kentucky, oftentimes, let me give you an example, and we'll say that our program is, we're not accountable for anything we say, or don't sue us or anything like that. But you can say, for instance, if you want to run and be elected in rural Kentucky right now, that you're for the Second Amendment, that you're not here to take their guns away, that only the opposing party wants to take your guns away. And if you're not careful, if you elect the other guy, he may come in your house and take your Bible away too. And that just fires people up and makes it very clear who you're going to vote for. But it's not about, well, what is your child learning in school?
What do you need?
What do you need? How do they feel about their education? What can we do to better society? Because, education is the crux in rural Kentucky that makes or breaks we as a society. If you want to improve society, you improve education. If you want to improve the economy, believe it or not, you improve education. You don't, talk about, I was in a small business last week, and a lady was carrying on, obviously to a group of people she was entertaining behind the counter, and she was saying, I got 2 pistols, and by God, I can't find one of them. She goes, but the other one, I know where it is. It's in my purse, and there ain't nobody going to come in this place, and take this gun away from me. And she was carrying on, and people were laughing. They were carrying on. She was very emotional about it. I had walked in on the conversation, and I'm sure that all the people surrounding her were politically in agreement with her and sympathized with her. But she was saying, by God, I'm going to keep my gun. You dare someone try to take it away from me. And I was thinking about, well, does your school have sufficient books?
Well, Mr. Pope, so how did we, as far as Kentucky history goes, how did we get to this point? Is this the tradition?
That's an excellent question. That's what people always say when they can't answer them. That's just a brilliant question on your part. I think that's the point of this podcast.
Okay.
And I think we go back to Elijah Craig, maker of whiskey. We're gonna start tying these things in we've talked about, because I said history is like a puzzle. It is a tradition, and traditions come from a source. And let's go back to the Traveling Church of Virginia. Why did these Baptists, 200 or 300 of them, and several churches in Virginia, pick up as a congregation and move west of the Appalachian Mountains? These were people that had homes, that were established and settled. They evidently felt confined. And what type of people came to Kentucky is another thing. These were Scotch-Irish people who were restless people, who didn't believe in government. They heard the voice of Patrick Henry. They continued on westward, away from traditional laws. This is right after the American Revolution, or even during it, where people mistrusted big government. They mistrusted the big wheels of society, and they didn't like it. When we even get into religion, there's so many things we can say about this, but Cane Ridge Meeting House that happened shortly after the Second Great Awakening in Bourbon County, Kentucky, with Barton W. Stone and Thomas Walker, that had these campground church revivals.
Yeah.
That it also led to the Shaker movement in Kentucky because this religious fervent that was very popular to be religious and so forth. So the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, of which I was associated with, and my father too, tying him into this, started at Cane Ridge Meeting House. There was, a mistrust of people. For instance, even in the church, if you want to talk about the Christian church, and I'll take a sideline here, Disciples of Christ, they came from the Presbyterian movement. But the Presbyterians at that time on Frontier, Kentucky, they had circuit riders that would come, circuit preachers, and they would come maybe once a month. And the Presbyterian church had a rule that you could only have communion when the minister was present.
Okay.
And these people, among other things, were very similar, and they still are close to the Presbyterian, which is a wonderful church and congregation. I love Presbyterians. But they decided, well, we don't need a minister to take communion. It's before God. So they broke off from the Presbyterian. And that's the only difference in the church is that Christian church, Disciples of Christ, basically, have communion every Sunday, and the Presbyterians have it maybe once every 3 weeks or something, 4 weeks. That's also kind of interesting. I know I'm circling the wagons here a little bit. I'm circling them and
that's all right. As long as the wheels are running, right?
Yeah, the wheels are running. Doesn't matter where they're running. Talking about these ministers that would come across Appalachian. Remember when we were at Pine Mountain, Jameson, and they talked to us about the sarvis tree? Do you remember that bush?
I believe so.
Do you remember the story that goes with it?
I don't know. I do not remember the story.
The sarvis bush, I think it's called the service, but they call it sarvis in eastern Kentucky.
Gotta get those A's in
there. Because when that was one of the first blooming trees or bushes in spring, and that was when that would give them an indication, because they obviously, I don't know if they didn't know time or what, but the circuit rider minister would come, and they would actually had like log corn crib type buildings in some areas of eastern Kentucky, around Hindman and different places like that, where people died over the winter. And they would put them on stretchers in layers, just like bunk beds, and wait to bury them because the ground was frozen. But it was also when the service minister would come, and also everyone would get married. So all the funerals would take place, and they'd put people in the ground when the ground thawed. All the young people would get married, in that time. Seasonal, rural, agrarian, Kentucky. Also, it's also known that as far as religion and politics going together, no greater force has changed Kentucky than its politics. And they're all interwoven, agriculture, churches, politics. But these revivals that they had and continue to have and continue to have to this day were oftentimes very popular in late summer and early autumn, because they would have them where farmers could attend them night after night right before the crops were harvested. People were very thankful, and they had a little free time on their hands. They'd done all the hoeing and weeding. It was just about chopping out tobacco, whatever they were doing, whether it was hay. Fall's coming on, and they would have these oftentimes at night. Well, it's also kind of interesting to say, and I think that's what podcasts are kind of for, is to talk about things that are sort of out of the ordinary. Hopefully makes it interesting. There was a problem with revivals, in that young women would dress up and look really good. And there were men that attended, young men that were kind of courting women and stuff, but there were bullies in the community. And I haven't seen very much written about this. These bullies would hang out on the outskirts of churches and revival tents, camp meetings, and they would challenge the other young men that were Christians and beat the fire out of them, or try to, because they were bowing for the attention of young, pretty dressed up girls in rural Kentucky. And they were bullies. And they would follow the church meetings when to beat people up. Now, isn't that interesting?
That's very interesting.
It shows you human nature. Shows you human nature. But going back to your original question about schools and churches and why this tradition, it has to do with the people, because, like I said, Elijah Craig and the traveling church, they came to Kentucky to get away from rules and regulations. They were not proactive necessarily people. They were simplistic in nature, provincial, if you want to say. And they reveled in that. They bragged about that. Just like John Sherman Cooper, when he got on the wagon, would talk the language of the men with guns over their shoulders and dogs on the leashes, standing around, barking, howling, guns going off. And he loved it. He reveled in that atmosphere. He spoke their language. And their language was that we still hear today, that if you call somebody a dirty, rotten son of a gun and tell them, that they're liars and their grandmothers are cheaters and everything else, prostitutes or whatever you want to say of them, any dirt you can fling draws attention to yourself. And traditionally, Kentucky voters have gone for that. They haven't been smart enough to go beyond that. They like that. If you see a sheriff running for office against somebody in a hot contested rural Kentucky county today, they oftentimes will put these ads on television that are just horrible. They show these dark pictures of masked people. Do you know he's a former bank robber? They make accusations, oftentimes lie, and it works. It works.
It does.
It really does.
Would you say that Kentucky people are loyal people, though?
I really would. They're loyal to their families. They're loyal to their traditions. You might say fearful to step out of traditions. Most of them are. But yes, they're very loyal to their families. They stick with them. And that, that's a great aspect. I don't necessarily mean to be difficult with Kentuckians, but I'd like to kind of call it like it is. And maybe, the purpose of history is to learn from it and how we can act a little better today and think about things. But Kentuckians are extremely loyal. They're loyal to their basketball teams. Number one, they're loyal to their families. They're loyal to their relatives. That's my kin. You're talking about my kin. I'm going to whoop you.
Well, here's a good story.
It don't matter if they're doing something bad. That's my kin.
Here's a good story. In a undisclosed school in Kentucky, we will not mention it.
One that we don't know of, I'm sure.
There were two girls fighting. For whatever reason, I have no idea. A teacher stepped in, a principal stepped in, and so instead of the two girls continuing to fight each other, they then turned around and started fighting the principal.
Principal, of course.
They're taking up for each other. And the saying, of course, is if you ever run into somebody, or a Kentucky boy is always headed home.
That's right. That's right. And some of our Kentucky authors have written about that, about the struggle of particularly Eastern Kentucky of leaving Kentucky and going to Detroit. The Doll Maker by Harriet Arnault was about the dissettlement of culture and how the adjustments were so cruel to be living in an inner city when you were used to the freedoms and family and the distance from them, and how sad, and how going after more money didn't necessarily make them happy, and trying to continue with the way of life that they were used to and so fond of. And it was so supportive of them. So, there's good and bad things. Some of the local churches, Jameson, have shooting for Jesus. They take their youth groups out on Sunday afternoon in the back of farms and they shoot guns. And I know you were saying that some of them shoot for Jesus with basketball.
I've seen that.
Some of the traditions we have in Kentucky, we don't want to lose. I'm not saying that those are some we should keep, but I'm not saying either way. And with the influence of people from the outside, I always get a little shaky and nervous, about newcomers coming in, But just like the German and the Irish that came in along the Ohio River, there are strains of new blood, and these are new times, and the world is constantly changing, and sometimes new ideas in communities, even rural communities of Kentucky, which are slow to change, can be good. And we don't want to get rid of all of our traditions. We want to protect some, and others we need to reconsider maybe.
There you go.
In a new world.
Well, I guess that wraps up our Kentucky Agrarian look at politics in Kentucky. If you have any thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us, you can find us on Twitter at KY History Pod, and you can also find us on Facebook, and we now have a Facebook page, The Land Between the Meadows. Just search that, and you can find our Facebook page, or you can search at KY History Pod and find it that way too. You can also email us, thelandbetweenthemeadows at gmail.com.
Or you can go to your county jail and look for a mugshot.
Search the county jail. There might be
the wanted posters in the post office. You might get a clear-cut picture of us.
So that being said,
all right, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.